Okay, so today we're diving deep into a story that really gets to the heart of the Israel-Hamas conflict.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's the story of the Bibas family, an Israeli family caught up in a hostage situation, unimaginable, really. And we've got a lot to unpack. We've got news articles, timelines, even some internal reports analyzing the impact of this whole thing.
What's really interesting about this case is that it goes way beyond one family's tragedy. It forces us to look at the human cost of this conflict and the incredibly difficult choices that both sides have to grapple with.
Absolutely. I mean, just try to picture this. You're living your life, everything's normal, and then suddenly everything changes. It all started back on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched this surprise attack on Israel.
Brutal.
Yeah, over 1,200 people were killed and 251 people, including the Bibas family, were abducted.
Wow.
That's Shiri, the mother, her husband Yarden, and their two little boys, 4-year-old Ariel and 9-month-old Kfir.
So to really understand this, you have to understand that the Israel-Hamas conflict, it's not just a simple border dispute, right? It's decades old. It's layers upon layers of political and religious disputes, territorial claims. It's a really tangled web.
And the Bibas family got caught right in the middle of it. For over a year, they were held hostage. Nobody knew what happened to them. And then in November 2023, this devastating news came out.
Yeah.
Reports started surfacing that both little Ariel and Kfir had been murdered while they were in captivity.
This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It really inflamed public opinion in Israel.
Yeah, it's just, the idea of innocent children, it made a peaceful resolution seem almost impossible.
Right.
And then in February 2025, there was a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
Yarden Bibas, the father, he was released as part of a ceasefire agreement. These agreements, they're kind of like a pause, a timeout in the fighting. The idea is to try and talk things through and hopefully work towards a longer-term peace.
Exactly. It's a chance to de-escalate.
But even with Yarden's release, the story's not over. The fate of Shiri and the boys was still unknown. It just added to the tension and uncertainty.
Of course.
And then on February 20th, 2025, Hamas hands over 4 bodies. They say these are the remains of the entire Bibas family and another hostage, Oded Lifshitz.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine what that moment must have been like for everybody who'd been waiting and hoping?
Just a roller coaster of emotions.
It seemed like maybe, just maybe, there might be some closure. But here's where things take a really dark turn. The very next day, February 21st, the Israeli military makes a shocking announcement. They confirm the bodies of Ariel and Kfir, the 2 little boys.
But
the body they thought was Shiri. It wasn't her.
it wasn't her at all.
It was someone else, completely.
Wow.
The wave of outrage and grief that swept through Israel was just immense. Prime Minister Netanyahu vowed vengeance, and the fragile truce that had brought Yarden home, it was suddenly in serious jeopardy.
So what happened next? What did Hamas do?
Well, first they claimed it was just a mix-up. They promised to find Shiri's real remains. But then things got even more complicated.
Okay, I'm listening. Well, you have to remember Hamas, they're not really known for being open and honest, are they?
No, not really.
So their explanations for this mix-up, well, they're worth looking at closely.
Definitely.
At first, they suggested that Shiri al-Adi might have gotten accidentally buried with Palestinian casualties, during all the chaos.
Yeah, I guess that's possible.
Then they said maybe it got mixed up during an Israeli airstrike.
Hmm.
But the thing is, those accounts, they just don't really add up.
So what was their game plan then?
Well, it makes you wonder, was this just damage control, trying to kind of salvage the truce?
Or were they trying to manipulate the whole situation to their advantage?
It's probably a bit of both, honestly. You see, even though Hamas, they have this image as these uncompromising hardliners, they were actually in a pretty vulnerable spot after the last round of fighting.
How so?
Well, Gaza had been hit really hard. Their resources were stretched thin. And another all-out war, that wouldn't really benefit them.
So they had to tread carefully.
Exactly. They had to at least try to look cooperative, maintain the truce, but at the same time, still try to get what they wanted.
Which was?
Well, don't forget the truce let them push for the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel.
Right.
That's a big win for them politically.
I guess it shows their supporters they're still fighting for the Palestinian cause.
Exactly.
It's amazing, isn't it, how both sides, even with all this hatred and mistrust, seem to recognize that there are actually strategic benefits to keeping the truce alive.
Yeah, it's complicated, but at the same time, we can't forget about the reaction in Israel. The Bibas tragedy, it triggered this huge public outcry. People were furious, demanding action.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Some even saw it as justification to just restart the war, hit Hamas hard, and try to prevent future attacks.
So you had this split in Israel then?
Yeah, exactly. You had those who wanted revenge, a show of force, and then those who still felt that sticking with the truce, even if it was flawed, was the only way to bring the remaining hostages home.
Wow, what a dilemma.
And this internal struggle was playing out very publicly. You had people like Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister. He's a hardliner.
Right.
He was calling for the total destruction of Hamas. No other solution, he said. No point in waiting.
That's a pretty extreme stand. Were other Israeli leaders on the same page?
Not quite. You had President Isaac Herzog. Now, he doesn't have a lot of actual power, but he appealed for a more, well, measured response.
What did he say?
He urged the government to prioritize bringing those hostages home safely. He said they had a moral obligation to try everything before resorting to more fighting.
So even within Israel itself, there was this whole spectrum of opinions then. It really shows how complicated and messy the situation was.
Absolutely. And remember, this wasn't just politicians debating. This tragedy really tapped into something deeper in Israeli society. This sense of fear, vulnerability, anger.
Like, how could we let this happen?
Exactly. How do we prevent it from happening again? These questions were weighing on everyone.
It makes you think about Ariel Bibas, released after all that time, only to be hit with this unimaginable loss.
It's just heartbreaking.
To be caught in this geopolitical chess match, to have your family become almost symbols in this larger conflict.
It's a reminder that behind all the politics, all the strategic maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are being shattered. The Bibas family, they're not just a news story, they're human beings.
And it's not just them. There are other hostages still being held, their families still waiting, hoping. Their stories often get lost in the noise of the conflict, but their suffering is just as real.
Absolutely. And that brings up a really important point, the whole issue of accountability. If it does turn out that those little boys were murdered by Hamas, like Israel claims, then there needs to be a proper investigation.
Yeah.
Those responsible need to be held accountable.
What if, like Hamas says, the family was killed in an Israeli airstrike?
Well, that needs to be investigated too.
Because without truth, without justice, can there ever be any hope of lasting peace?
It's a tough question, and it's not just about assigning blame. It's about recognizing the humanity on both sides, understanding the pain and the fear and the anger that fuel this conflict.
You know, as we're talking about this, I keep thinking about the Geneva Conventions. Those are like the rules of war, right?
Right.
They're supposed to protect civilians, especially children.
Exactly, and those rules, they're not just some abstract ideas. They're meant to prevent exactly these kinds of horrors. Targeting civilians, especially kids, it's a war crime, plain and simple.
Yeah.
But even when lives aren't lost, the trauma of something like this, especially for children, it's immense. The fear, the uncertainty, the disruption, these are wounds that can take generations to heal.
It's a reminder that the true cost of war goes way beyond just the immediate casualties. It affects families, communities, entire societies.
And those wounds, they can fester for years, even decades, making true peace that much harder to reach.
It's tough, you know, we've been talking so much about strategies in politics, but I keep thinking about the people, like the actual human beings at the heart of all this.
Yeah, that's the important part, isn't it?
It's so easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget about the individuals whose lives are being turned upside down.
Like the Bibas family.
Exactly.
While leaders are making decisions and giving speeches, it's real people like them who are actually living through this nightmare. Ariel Bibas, after being held hostage for over a year, comes home to the just devastating loss of his 2 young sons and still not knowing what happened to his wife.
I can't even imagine.
That kind of pain, it's just beyond politics, you know?
And it's not just Yarden. Think about all the other hostages still being held by Hamas. Their families are just waiting, clinging to hope.
Yeah, it's easy for those stories to get lost in all the news and the analysis, but their suffering is real.
It's a reminder that every headline, every statistic, it represents a human being with hopes and dreams.
And they're caught in the crossfire of a conflict they didn't choose.
This case, the Bibas family, it makes you think about the responsibility of both sides, Israel and Hamas, to protect civilians, especially children.
Absolutely.
The deaths of those little boys, Ariel and Kfir, no matter how it happened, it highlights how tragic it is when civilian safety isn't the top priority.
The Geneva Conventions, those rules of war we talked about, they're not just some abstract document. They're there for a reason.
To prevent these kinds of horrors.
Right. Targeting civilians, and especially children, is a violation of international law, a war crime, and everyone should condemn it.
No excuses?
None. And even when lives aren't lost, the psychological impact on these kids caught in the middle of this.
It's huge.
The trauma can last a lifetime. The fear, the loss, the constant uncertainty.
Those are wounds that can take generations to heal.
That's the real cost of war. It goes so much deeper than the immediate casualties. It affects families, communities, entire societies.
And makes peace that much harder to achieve.
Which brings up another question. Can there ever really be true peace, true healing in a place so deeply scarred by conflict? Can those underlying issues ever be addressed? The mistrust, the resentment, the fear that keeps fueling the cycle of violence.
Is it even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, right? A purely military solution, it might seem like the answer in the short term.
Got it.
But it doesn't solve those deeper problems. It can't erase the anger and the hurt that just keep leading to more violence.
So what's the alternative?
A real, lasting peace, it needs a lot of effort from both sides.
What kind of effort?
They need to be willing to talk, to really listen to each other, to try and understand each other's pain and perspectives.
And to find solutions that actually address everyone's concerns, both Israelis and Palestinians.
Exactly, and that includes dealing with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the despair.
That's fertile ground for extremism.
As awful as it is, the Bibas tragedy might actually be a chance to create a better dialogue. It's possible. The brief, the outrage, the focus on the hostages, all of that could push both sides towards a more lasting peace.
It's a glimmer of hope.
It is, but it also highlights how important it is to be informed, to really think about what we're seeing and hearing.
We're bombarded with information all the time, from every direction. It's hard to know what to believe.
You have to be careful. Look out for those biased stories, the emotionally charged language that's designed to manipulate us.
We need to question what we see, look for different perspectives.
Talk to people we disagree with, even if it's uncomfortable.
It's not just about being informed, it's about doing something, getting involved.
This conflict, it's not just over there, it affects all of us.
So what can we do?
Well, there are organizations doing amazing work on the ground, helping people. You can support them.
Or advocate for policies that prioritize peace.
Even just talking about it, having respectful conversations with people who see things differently.
Every little bit helps.
Yeah, this deep dive into the Bibas family tragedy, it's been a stark reminder of what's at stake.
But maybe it can also push us to do better.
Peace isn't just some naive dream. It's something we have to work for.
It takes courage, compassion, a willingness to step outside our comfort zone.
To try and understand each other.
To build a world where tragedies like this one don't happen again.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.